Welcome to the Thoughtful Software Podcast. Innovate and thrive with thoughtful software. This podcast is all about helping technology leaders simplify innovation, build emerging tech, and confidently fuel digital initiatives. Join Andrew Wolf and Fahad Shokat as they discuss how to navigate the ever-changing software landscape. Keep it simple, focus on people, and consistently deliver value.
All right, Andrew, the other day, a friend who just launched their startup asked me if building their product in C# is the right choice. Granted, I'm not the expert, I think you are in this area, but I told him it kind of depends on the skill set of the current team. And if they feel comfortable with that, then that's how they should move forward. However, during one of our conversations, we started talking about it, and there are trade-offs to consider that you brought up, and I thought it was fascinating that we should kind of discuss that today and talk about that, building applications and building development teams, because the technology that you use, the tech stack, does affect velocity. And one point you brought up is on who you attract to the team, which I thought was really interesting. So we'll also talk about how not all developers are the same, and maybe dive into how to even manage developers remotely, which is a big thing now. But maybe we can start in today's environment. How should you think about putting together a development team as a non-technical founder or as a non-technical executive? What where should you start thinking about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So there's really I think you have to do two things to really figure out what type of team you need. You need to look at the size of your organization, all right, and the maturity of the organization. If you're a one person startup and you're looking to build a technical team, you need something different than if you're a 100,000 person organization trying to build a team to potentially staff a project. So let's work with the startup and then we'll work our way up to the complexity of an enterprise. So to start up, you have to look, do you have a technical founder or not? And who is the matured and what is the maturity of that technical founder? And I mean that in the sense of oftentimes the technical founders these days are on the younger side, in their 20s, might have 3 or 4 years of experience, if any. They might be fresh out of college. And so when you think about building a technical team there, a consideration is how much seniority do you need to build a great system? It takes 15 years to learn that kind of thing, because in truly software is a game of trade-offs, and you have to make the mistakes to really learn the consequences of your choices. And so bringing in a senior person might be good for that particular thing, but we'll talk about that later and how to adjust seniority versus juniorness and what each give you. I mean, maturity can have downsides to it as well. And so as you're looking at building a team, here are some things you have to consider. Your programming stack. So which language did you pick? At a small organization, you might want something that is extremely quick to develop in, because it matters about velocity and speed to market and things like that. So picking what we call dynamic programming language like Python or JavaScript could be very awesome for moving quickly. However, those things don't work at scale. And we're going to talk about scale, not in the sense of the number of users, and that's true too. Some of these languages don't really scale very well from just a compute power perspective, but from a number of developers coding on it. So for example, the reason Netflix went and used microservices, and we talked about this in the previous podcast, is because their code base complexity can be much easier, so they can still use dynamic languages. But in a large monolithic code base without basic functions in your language, like typing, type is like how you define a variable and what type it is, whether it's an integer or a string. Those compile time guarantees have a huge impact on how big your team can get. And so it's important to look at the trade-offs there. There's another trade-off in picking your tech stack as well, which is hiring people. And you alluded to in your beginning, as you're hiring people, you want to excite people. When you're early, you don't have a brand and you can't pay as much as Google or Netflix. So how do you get people? You use new and exciting things. They can come and grow because they want to learn Rust, which is like a cool programming language these days. So they join your startup to work on Rust. And that's how you can attract top tech talent without necessarily paying them $300K that Netflix would pay them. And so you're able to attract them that way. And that's why a lot of startups, why they don't need something like Kubernetes or some sort of hot new SQL data, NoSQL database or what have you. They do it so that the cool people want to come work and they're perceived as a cool hire and people can come and learn. So that's the first consideration you have when you're building a team. How do you want to attract your talent? If you're an extremely well-funded startup, doesn't matter. You can pay as much as Netflix and get those same people. So now you might be able to pick a more conservative tech stack and hire for that. And there's always going to be more availability on the more mature languages like Python, JavaScript, Java, C#, because it's just been around longer. So once you have your tech stack picked, you then have to look at, okay, so how fast do I want to move? I mentioned seniority here. Senior developers are going to move slower than junior developers. Why? Because they're going to make better decisions and they're going to take the time to write the code and refactor the code base and keep it in good shape because they've suffered through bad code management, no testing in their careers. And so they're going to move a bit more conservatively than an extremely junior developer. Is that a good thing? Well, in the short term, no, if you're a startup that has to move fast. But if you're an enterprise, moving slow is great because that means you have longevity. And if you're making the investment in enterprise, if you're Walmart's going to be there 2 years from now, 10 years from now, potentially 20 years from now, right? Like they're going to be here. So them investing in these products in stability and things like that is worth having that seniority. Looking at, okay, how fast do I have to move? And what can I throw to the wayside? Once you have those considerations done, the last thing you need to look at in terms of hiring a technical team is, again, leadership. And there's two types of leaders in technology. There's people leaders. These are your managers, your directors, your VP of engineering. They're extremely good at career pathing, understanding people, explaining to the people how they fit in the organization, dealing with morale issues, things like that. And then there's technical leaders. And these are your tech leads, your principal engineers, your architects, those type of people. They might not have the people skills, but they help you get well-designed systems. They run and run and run and manage the health of the system. And so when you look at a startup, most startups need one technical leader. They don't even need a people manager because usually the CEO or some sort of business person handles that, and they're not big enough to need the people management and career pathing and considerations like that. So a startup, you need that. But at an enterprise where these teams could be 60, 70 people, having people managers in there to make sure that everyone's taken care of is super important. And so making sure you have that technical leadership, whether that comes from the technical co-founder or you have to hire that person, it's super important that you have it. And so then it's just about hiring, right? Who are you hiring for? What skill set do you need based on your programming stack? How are you choosing to attract talent and everything else? And then it comes into putting systems and processes in place to enforce the behavior you want on your technical team.
That's so interesting. Let me ask you actually about the first point that you made around picking the tech stack, because there's some interesting nuances that you mentioned that I don't think many people would consider. Attracting new talent based on the programming language that you're using. Let's maybe take a use case around there. Like if you're putting a team together and you have like these early engineers that are comfortable with a technology that's not necessarily scalable or very attractive, do you just start with what they're comfortable with, or do you actually try to organize around something new or something creative or attractive that that later on you're going to need these types of engineers?
I would say a couple things. If my development team didn't want to learn new programming languages because they weren't comfortable with it and they pushed back on that, that's a huge smell for me at a startup. I think everyone at a startup has to have a growth mentality because the company's going to grow incredibly fast. Startups now are going from 1 million ARR to 10 million in a year and growing at ridiculous speeds because sales is so much easier. It's so automatic, so digital. If you don't have a growth mindset, that's going to crush your team. They're not going to be able to continue because even the things that work, Twitter's a great example, right? They were completely a Rails shop. And then they started getting that fail whale. You remember fail whale from I don't know, it's probably 13 years ago now or something like that. They rewrote their entire code base in Scala Okay, Scala is a JVM, Java Virtual Machine based language in like 6 months. And Scala was brand new when this happened, by the way. I think they still use Scala, but not as much at Twitter. But either way, their team had a growth mindset and said, hey, listen, we can't get Rails to do what we needed to do. So they rewrote it in a brand new language. And now look how big Twitter is. And that's the kind of mindset you have to have at a startup, especially if you're going and growing really fast. And so anyone pushing back on potentially using a new language is a bad smell on a technical team, especially at a startup. I think the way I would do it is I would say, hey, again, it's based on your people strategy. How am I going to acquire people? Am I going to pay market salaries to people saying, hey, you're going to get, as much as you get anywhere else? Or are you going to say we're going to track because we're running the hottest stuff? We're running the next version of Kubernetes. We're running, all this AWS stuff, and it's exciting to come to work because you're learning so much so quickly. And there's always a mix here, right? Like we don't do all the hottest stuff, but we do some of the hottest stuff, and we also pay pretty decent as far as startups go. That's another strategy to do. And it's a mix and match as well, right? You could use hot front end frameworks because your user experience matters more than the scalability of your back end. That's usually true on B2B type companies because usability is important more so than you never at a B2B application. You very rarely get billions of users. You might get hundreds of thousands, right? And so you don't have the same concerns that say a Twitter would have. And also, it depends on the challenging part of your startup. If your startup is a really hot, cutting edge AI company, that's attractive because of the problems you're solving. And so you can solve those in Python or a less cool language, as it were, and people will be excited because they're coming to solve a problem too. So there's myriad of scope here on how to attract engineers. But your primary thing on tech stack should be one, can I solve the business problem with it, whether that's C#. Second should be the ecosystem, right? A lot of these unmature languages don't have the same ecosystem as C# does, or Java, or Python, or any of those have in them. And the reason for that is that, these languages have been around a long time, and so they've had time for open source to really help it out. But the ecosystem can really accelerate your startup, or it can stifle it because it doesn't have the right library. So everyone's, as it were, reinventing the wheel that in another language you'd have off the shelf. For example, PDFs almost killed one of my startups that I founded because Python had a poor PDF thing. I had to write, now luckily I'm a polyglot programmer, so I know multiple programming languages, but I had to go learn the PDF box thing in Java and write a Java microservice that was like sidecarred onto my Python deployment because Python had a poor PDF support. And that's just one example of the programming language doing it. And the third is, again, your hiring strategy, right? Who do you want to attract? You want to attract the people doing cool stuff that move fast, right? Or do you want to attract the more stingy, developers that, might be a little more jaded? But again, if you're running in a PCI compliant type startup, things like that, it might not be a bad idea to have those kind of developers around so you don't make the same mistakes some startups do.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I think there is some a risk, right, in chasing the latest and greatest, hottest new language that may not know might scale or may not have all the different libraries available. And kind of working with what you do know is, for certain industries, I think that's a very interesting point. What about like for enterprise? You obviously, I think in enterprise, it's difficult. I think most cases you'll see enterprises when they're looking at new applications or something new that they'll organize around their current engineers that they might have. I don't know if they're necessarily looking out. Maybe they are. What do you do in that case? Do you again start looking at this different skill sets, or you just see what you have today and try to just get things off the ground? How would you approach that?
So, enterprises have a beautiful thing where they can throw bodies at problems, right? Meaning that no one individual is too important in an enterprise, right? And that's on purpose. Enterprises are built to hedge against risk. They don't do risky things, and they don't do it on purpose. They're there to return money to their shareholders. And so in that way, a huge enterprise is, yes, they're going to rally around their team, but the way and tech choices that you make can be more conservative and you can move slower because a lot of people moving slower can move, sometimes as fast as, a small team moving fast. And so the thing there is a lot of enterprises, they balloon their architecture because they can have a more complex architecture. They can start at a different scale than a startup can. And so as you're building out your team there, I would look at new technologies, because if you don't have a concept of reinventing technologies, what happens is you adopt one language and then everyone at that company uses one language, and there's no real spirit of innovation there, right? No one's pushing the boundaries of what's possible in computation, and you're then stifled by your thing. So I think there has to be a step where you're spinning up your team. Is this a project that we want to try to innovate on and bring in new technology, new DNA into the organization? And there are some projects and some products that don't require it because of the maturity of the product. But when you're first building a new product line out, I think you should always ask yourself, should we innovate here? Right? And if we should, how should we innovate? And spend your innovation points wisely. Maybe it is a new programming language. But at an enterprise, you can spend money to retool your workforce and say, hey, we're going to drop 300,000 and send these people to a Rust programming language thing, and they're going to learn Rust for a week or 2 weeks, and they can afford that because they can afford time. And so they have a different set of problems of, who are my good people? Who are the people with a growth mindset? Who are growing? Who wants to grow? And managing the people that are willing to be ambitious and aggressive with their careers there, and giving that to them. On the other side, startups don't have a choice but to be ambitious and aggressive no matter what, or they die. It's about, finding. I would say an enterprise is less about acquiring technical talent and more about managing technical talent and making sure you keep the good ones that do come through the door.
As a top developer, what excited you the most? Like what got you going in these different trade-offs? If you were like, I know you used to be kind of in real estate and banking, you've been in across the board and also different hot startups. Like, did you understand that there's a business value that you need to achieve, and it won't necessarily be the latest and hottest language, but you also got excited if that was available?
For me, I never really cared much about the programming language. I only made that choice one time, to join a company that had a good programming language. Most of the time, I try to focus on the problem that we're solving and in a cool space. And so I was more like concerned about, when I joined Tableau, I was excited about data visualization and learning a lot about data visualization, how to solve the key problems around taking all kinds of data and understanding the data and being able to visualize it into graphs. That was really cool for me. And then when I started my real estate company, a real estate startup, that was around joining a company that had AI and learning about AI and using my skills there. And then other startups, it was about technical leadership and learning. But for me, it was always about growth. How can I grow myself to be better and learn more about my craft and do things differently, more so than actual programming languages. But I know a lot of my friends, some of the people that are even better at programming than I am, they pick startups all the time on their stack. I have a friend that joined a company out when he left Tableau because they were doing Node.js when Node.js was new and hot and exciting. And he wanted to learn that, and he wanted to work in a JavaScript ecosystem. And so in that way, he would join a company if they were using Kubernetes, which he did because he joined as a DevOps guy so he could implement Kubernetes when it wasn't its early stage. So there's just people that love that kind of stuff. I think for each developer, you sit down and kind of, finding a really excellent developer, a really excellent technical leader could have you change your calculus too. Like you could be thinking we're going to write and go, but you sit down with a really excellent person who's going to be a technical leader for you a long time, and they give you a really good reason to adopt this stack. And then they're able to bring in technical talent they've worked with in the past, and you choose what they want to do too, and so that you can attract top talent, which can be a very exciting thing for a startup, especially if they're looking to further tech direction. Is recruiting by saying, hey, you get to own this entire thing end to end. You own the build up of the platform, the deployment, everything else. That could be exciting because I get bored working on one thing. So sometimes I want to do DevOps, sometimes I want to do front end development, sometimes I want to do back end development, and really great projects that excite me. I get to do all of it. and keep all my skills sharp instead of just one of them.
Let's talk about that attracting and recruiting. So, how do you actually screen for something like this? There could be a case where eh, some technical leader just wants to work on something new, and it's not really married to the business value, and it could be some self-serving bullshit. Like I want to work on this really cool thing. I think we've seen that with developers that have their own agenda. Is there a way to you know, talk about that as a founder or an enterprise leader? Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's actually really easy to screen for. I always ask people in the I was always the bar raiser when I interviewed engineers, and I don't do that too much these days because we have such a great team here. What I'd always ask is, tell me why you chose a technology one time and give me the reasons for it. And 9 out of 10 times, the people will give you some reason that's like, depending on their seniority, they'll pick it well. And you see that they're not self-serving, but every once in a while you hear the person be like, "Oh, I picked it because we need to do this, this, and this," and then you dig deep into their answers there, and you'll find out that they're full of shit. Right? Like they didn't pick it because they needed to do this. They picked it because they wanted to pick it. There's no evidence that it was actually better. There's no evidence that it was going to solve the problem better. They picked it because that's what they wanted to do. Which sometimes when all things are equal, picking it because you want to do it isn't a bad choice, right? Because if that's the only differentiator, let's all have fun with it. 99% of the time, that's never the case. There's always a technology that has the better of the two things, and so you always pick that one. For me, like I said, asking them to defend their choices is the best way to understand why people made choices, and that's across the board. If you're interviewing a salesperson, a good question could be, "Hey, you fought for a customer discount. Which customer did you get them a discount and why?" And you could, the typical sales bullshit thing, the analogous to picking frameworks just to do it, is giving a discount just to close the deal faster, right? Or to serve the salesperson. It's bullshit. It doesn't help the organization and just actively hurts your pricing and market. Same thing with technology people. And you can always suss out the thing because they can never defend the decisions that they made, no matter how much they try.
And how important it is now for developers to be more cross-functional and understand, like you've mentioned this several times, understanding business value, business enablement. Is that a requirement now for developers to understand more about context, not just, the latest and greatest?
I think you have to, depending on your seniority. If you're just a line engineer and you're a junior developer or a mid-level, probably not as important to ask those questions. But if you're a senior onward, you need to start deeply understanding the business that you're in. And as you become a leader, right, you have to understand not only where the company's going, but where the market might force you to go, right? Because if you're making good architecture and you're actually making good decisions, understanding where the market's going, the best strategies fall apart on the battlefield because battles are chaotic and so are companies and so are markets. And in that way, you have to understand and look at the market and say, the market's going to do this in 2 or 3 years. Our strategy looks like it aligns to it, but it's going to change. And so being able to build an actual system that enables you as you grow up in the ranks as technical leadership. If you don't, then you're going to build bad architectures because you're not going to enable the business to respond to the market in appropriate ways. So I think you have time to learn it if you're a junior engineer, but by the time you're senior or principal, you got to do it. And the other skill you have to learn is how not to be selfish. As a developer, you never get to have it your way. You need to sacrifice what you want for the good of the business, right? Like everything when you get to the CTO level has to be about enabling the business. We all have priorities and we all have in some way some sort of an agenda. Your agenda though can never supersede that of the business. And I think as you get into seniority, that makes more sense. But I know CTOs and other people that, they don't ever put the business first. They're putting their agenda first, which either will get you fired or if it doesn't, kill the business because you will never be able to build the most valuable thing because you're more worried about building what you want to build.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we've seen some cases where CTOs have come in and completely wrecked the company because of their own personal agenda. Do you see any good signs of technology leaders that do understand that mindset and actually practice it, and they're not going to come in and just completely destroy the engineering team because of whatever they wanted to accomplish.
If I'm hiring for a leader, I want them to ask what my plans for the next 90 days are. And if they don't ask that question, they either don't care, which is shitty, they're not that bought in, or they don't know what they're doing. And knowing the organizational plans for the next 90 days helps them come in and level set what they might need to do when they get there, and helping by asking questions around the business itself. What do you guys do? How are you going to do it? What's your vision for this? That kind of stuff helps the technology leader really understand what they have to do. But also, if you're hiring for a team, if you don't understand the vision, how do you hire for it? What's the roadmap? Well, you have to hire for that roadmap, right? What's the 2-year, 3-year, 4-year roadmap for this thing? And if you're not hiring a year or 6 months ahead of time, by the time you get to that place on the roadmap, you won't be prepared for it. And so you have to be kind of looking at the roadmap, looking where you are, doing an index of the skills on your team, what skills you need, and whether or not you can either upskill somebody to do it or you have to bring in fresh blood. All that stuff matters. On top of that, they're constantly looking at how to grow other people, right? Unselfish leaders grow other leaders to own stuff and get that there. They build their replacement. And in that way, they're constantly mentoring people. You can ask them, "Hey, when is the last person you mentored?" Like when you're leaving your job right now, assuming you're interviewing a technology leader, who's replacing you? And I'll tell you everything you need to know. If they say, "Well, I'm being replaced from the outside," you probably know that they were fired or the company outgrew them in the best case. On the other side, if they say, "I don't know," that's a bad smell, because usually if you're good, you'll know exactly who's replacing you because you've groomed that person. Groom's a bad word now. Develop that person to be your replacement. And that's another sign that this person's a mature technology leader who's going to put the continuity of the business above their own agenda.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. In your career, like what does good technical mentorship look like? What are some best practices or things that you've seen that work well that have helped junior or mid-level engineers?
In my career, when I was a junior engineer, the best things were multiple things. We would co-program, we would pair program a lot, and that would help me understand their thinking. The other part that did was code reviews and helping the other developers do code reviews. As I matured and I became the one doing code reviews and pair programming, I kind of mixed the two. I would review, and if it was like a egregious mistake, I would go and sit down with them and I'd help them fix it rather than just adding a comment and show them why the thing wasn't very good. And then as you mature even more, I think the important part is, I think I've said this on the podcast before, every significantly important role at a company is a sales job. And then it becomes helping people sell their ideas, right? When you're a tech lead, very rarely, I'm an idea guy, so I always had great ideas. But on the other side, I never always felt like I had the best ideas. Other people in your team are going to have some of the best ideas. So you have to help them sell their idea to the organization by either using your power to get the right people in the room and having that person pitch and mentoring them how to pitch an idea, or getting them to use you to pitch it. And so you have to then do that as well. Some other really great things that companies can do is like book clubs, and sitting down and learning together is an important part of a culture. And really, mentorship for junior developers comes with first helping them do stuff, helping them just be able to execute, even if they execute poorly, just helping them execute. The second is helping them execute well, and almost encouraging failure, right? Pushing the boundaries every now and again to promote people failing, because everyone says there's this old adage of 10,000 hours, and I always joke and say it's not 10,000 hours, it's 10,000 mistakes. And if you're really good, you'll make a mistake an hour, and so you keep doing things and you'll get there in 10,000 hours. But it really is 10,000 mistakes. And so getting to the point where you can help these people make the mistake, learn from it, and make that constructive is the loop that you need, because there's just so many ways to do things in engineering. There's no right way to do things in engineering, unfortunately, but there are a lot of wrong ways to do it. And honestly, most people have to learn the wrong way before they can learn that, okay, this is why you don't do that. learn and put the guardrails up of all the wrong ways to do things so that you can kind of do things in a right way, if that makes sense.
And well, sometimes you get these top developers, I mean, top sales guy or anybody that's really good gets this prima donna like label, right? And they're superstars. I guess it's okay in some ways, but you mentioned guardrails and just maybe best practice. But how would you manage somebody like that as a top developer, superstar? They want to pick up cars, they want to just build their own thing, or they just kind of color outside the lines. How would you manage those situations?
I know this may come off as shocking to some people that know me, but I used to be that way when in my younger days. I'm
Really?
still kind of young. Yeah, yeah, right. I think what helped me get past that barrier was when I had to lead a team. And before I had to lead a team, I got to be the selfish individual contributor. Fuck it, I'll just do all the points to sprint. You all sit back and watch me work. And I didn't realize the consequences for my actions because why would I, right? They didn't have any. I had a good leader who prevented me from seeing the toxicity I was bringing to the team. But when I had to manage that same toxicity, I was able to understand my consequences. And I think it comes down to is bringing the person aside and realizing that you can go faster alone. It's absolutely true. But if you want to go further, you have to do it together and helping them understand they're suboptimal by acting in the way they're acting and helping them understand. I don't, there's some people that can be like, okay, well, I'm out. And they're brilliant jerks, is what we call them. And, there's a time and place for brilliant jerks, and it's called the closet. You put them in the closet, you let them get some R&D work done. But for team-based work, you have to make sure people check their ego at the door and really encourage people to realize that they're hurting the team more than they're helping the team. And that usually works. On the other side, too, if you do have a brilliant jerk, I think it's important, too, to realize that people get into the technical field because they lack social skills, right? I was a jerk for a different reason, but most people lack social skills. And, that means you just have to develop that person's empathetic side and help them really realize that, listen, maybe what they're saying is true, but it's hurtful. And like, you shouldn't go around hurting people. And, it shocks some people. And I know some people in business don't understand this because they have really good or elite social skills. A lot of these developers don't. And that's something you have to mentor. That's something we call it soft skills, but like, honestly, they're not really soft skills. It's just as hard to communicate well, be empathetic, see the other people's point of views and everything and do that, then honest time programming it's much harder to do the other stuff. So I don't want to call them soft skills because I think it diminishes that they're actually really hard to do well. And so I just think doing that and providing the mentorship in that category. But again, it's about meeting people where they're at and understanding this person might not know any better. So it's okay to call them a jerk because that's what they are, but also understand that maybe if they're smart enough to do what they do at the level they're doing it, they're smart enough also to correct their behavior. They just might not know they're doing anything wrong, and no one wants to stand up to them.
Yeah, I think it's also a lot to do with setting expectations. So, building that early product with there's no idea or it's just, you're putting it on a napkin. That's maybe a good time to just start, you know, pushing forward, breaking down walls, getting things out. I get that point. But then if you help them understand that eventually you do need to formalize your operation, you need to grow up. There's customers now that are going to be involved. They're expecting something. You have release dates, budget constraints, things like that, so that you gradually want to be more mature. So I think if you just try to set those expectations, you eventually people generally understand, okay, here's what I'm, tasked to do, and here's how the company is growing as well.
Yeah. And again, I think it's helping that person realize where their place is and everything else. 100% setting expectations. Again, most of these people are incredibly ambitious. When the manager pulled me aside, and you met my manager before in Seattle, he referred to me as managing a flamethrower. Incredibly effective, but you have to point it in the right direction or you burn your house down. And so in that way, but he explained to me, I'm losing my ability to grow in the organization because of my toxicity. And he sat me down and explained, listen, you have to do it this way, right? You might not like it. It might not be the funnest part, but it is something you have to do. And when he did it that way, and he gave me opportunities to mentor myself, and like he made me a scrum master because I had to lead the team now. So he gave me the responsibility while also keeping me close enough to the chest that if I were to like blow something up by accident, he would be able to fix it. And by doing that, and honestly, he's the best manager I've ever had. He grew me, 10x because I did have the capability to grow fast, and I did have the ambition and the want to grow up to be in management and everything else. And so in that way, he really pushed me along far and fast because of his willingness to throw me into the deep end, but also throw me a life preserver as well. Doing so.
Yeah, that's interesting. So a lot of things in Silicon Valley I don't like. One of them is around, I know a lot of investors and founders, they raise a lot of money because they expect you to be in the office and they want to be able to see your face. And I know a lot of companies here in the Bay Area, Google, Facebook, they're in Apple, they're asking everyone to come back. And COVID obviously blew that up, that, we have to be adaptable and remote. Do you find it easier or harder to manage technical teams remotely? And I'm sure you'll have a preference, but have you found that to be not a problem, or do you really need to be together on one site to get, amazing things done?
I think people are sub-optimizing by staying in one location and not hiring remote. My preference is that it's hybrid in the sense of like, spending some time together somehow, some way, but also like getting out and working remotely. I believe people are more productive from where they're comfortable. It's hard to find a place that's more comfortable than your own home. And I believe that creates psychological safety, right? Like when you have to say hard things as a team, in front of each other, people shut down. No one wants to have the hard conversation in front and tell someone that they're fucking up. But over the phone, it's a little easier. And so I think hard conversations happen more frequently remotely. And that's really good for an organization. Now, there's this whole idea of a liquid network of ideas, and that gets created around the water cooler. I am not convinced that that has to happen in person either. I think you can create the same water cooler effect where people are chatting about ideas and stuff by doing events and having fun with each other and doing stand-ups and company, meetings and everything. I think truly you can simulate most of it. Now, there is one issue that makes remote hard, and that's trust. It's much easier to trust somebody when you see their body language, when you see everything else. And if you know the person, then you usually know their intent as well. So it takes more time to build rapport and trust remotely. But as technology gets better and better, Zoom, all this other stuff, I think that becomes less and less of a barrier. I think that the huge benefit and the reason companies like Google and Apple can't actually go remote is because they don't have a culture of communication and doing that. But if you were remote first from the beginning, that communication's in your DNA because you have to over communicate to make your team work well that you don't have to do in person. So I think Google and Apple, while they're probably more productive, they probably weren't as aligned. And so they were productive in a lot of different directions. And they're seeking that alignment by coming back in person. And that's just how they're going to solve it. But I truly think that they're capping their capabilities. I mean, if you're going back to Cupertino, I mean, there's like 30% of tech workers moved out of San Francisco during COVID. Like, yikes. Like, what are you doing right now? Like, you're going to cap your workforce. You're going to get rid of all these amazing people you potentially hired during the pandemic. And that's just going to cripple your workforce. And then when the people that had friends go somewhere, they're going to recruit the other people over. So I think it's just going to have a crippling effect on those kind of companies. I mean, not like bring Google down to its knees kind of thing, because it's really hard to kill a company like Google. But on that side, it's, I think it is going to have a massive effect. And I think most companies should consider staying remote, especially as this entire situation. I mean, a lot of cities are trying to become the next Silicon Valley. Miami is the hot one, but LA, Salt Lake, there's a couple legitimate examples of places that people are really excited about that have a lot of tech talent moving there. Who knows? Cleveland's not one of them, mind you. I mean, we did get a lot of tech talent during COVID, but that's just, I think, by accident. Um, so, yeah.
Is there a real danger for these big companies to lose top tech talent because of this, or they'll still attract the really great engineers just because they can pay so much?
For Google and Facebook, well, for Google, they can, because they're working on literally the bleeding edge on a lot of things, and they have scale problems other people don't. So Google will be fine. Apple will be fine because they have a really sexy brand and everyone wants to work on the iPhone or something else. Like, they just have cool projects everyone uses. Now let's talk about
Facebook's in
Facebook.
trouble.
Yeah, Facebook has none of that. They have a crap brand. Developers hate them. Like, they're ruining society. They rigged an election. Like, they just have nothing going for them. They're paying more than Netflix is now, and their stock option things are ridiculous, right? So they can't even recruit people. But companies like that, they're going to have a tough time. And you know what? Netflix is I think, an example I use a lot. I don't know if their culture is going to continue to stand up to that the idea we only have A players here, maybe, but you're going to burn through all the A players, and they already kind of have. Right, the people there now, like, I know people that work at Netflix, and that old adage of only A players. These people are not A players. Like, they're good. Good enough to get through an interview, but they ain't A players. They're B plus, which is very adequate for what they need. But they're gonna have a hard time too, because they churned through so much talent in the early days. I can't imagine a world that Fang isn't still like a really good place to go work and get some mentorship and get cool perks and pay and all that stuff. But I don't know if that's as attractive right now. And especially since startups are getting such great valuations, people are getting insanely wealthy really quickly. And you're going to get wealthy working at Facebook or Google or Amazon, but it's going to take you 6 years. And a startup, you can go from employee 3 to $1 billion exit in 4 years now. And now you're fucking at 1.5% or something like that. And you're, even after dilution, like you made a couple, 10, 15 million. And so the startups are the attractive option right now, just because the amount of money in the market, everything. That won't be true forever, but it is true right now.
Thanks for listening. You can always connect with us at skiplist.com.